Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 5 of series 8. The question for the day is, what can phenomenology tell us about consciousness that psychology doesn't? Reading for this work, The Pursuit of Value, chapter 1, section 9. So my underlying question is again, what can we do with our lives or human existence? My question isn't what is the meaning of life, or what is the moral good, or how can we be happy? These questions may or may not be valid, but they assume presuppositions that aren't legitimate. They can't be assumed to be biological, sociological, or psychological questions. Yet determining what kind of question we should ask is a philosophical question. This is one reason why I focus on consciousness as a more encompassing and specific aspect of humanity. I then attempt to explicate the problems of consciousness and answer in terms of value. But psychology is already available as a study of mind or consciousness. So why should we employ philosophy or phenomenology rather than psychology? That is the question that we want to discuss this evening. Yet we need to initially define phenomenology, which we do as a descriptive account of consciousness. Phenomenology typically employs a descriptive method of its subject matter, that is consciousness. But phenomenology is a very diverse school of thought, catering to many different views. Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit, for example, is really a metaphysical work. Three bona fide phenomenologists with diverse views are Husserl, Heidegger and Sartre. And Husserl, Heidegger and Sartre become less and less objectivist and more existentialist. We can also compare and contrast phenomenology with other philosophical approaches. It contrasts to analytic philosophy, which focused on language, logic, verifiability and problems of knowledge. And unlike analytic philosophy, phenomenology is interested in appearance, not hidden reality. Phenomenology also provides a theoretical basis for existentialism, but is not the same as existentialism. Existentialism is primarily concerned with human action, situations and experience rather than theory. Phenomenology contrasts not only to analytic philosophy and existentialism, but also to science and psychology. I will answer the question why we need phenomenology as well as psychology shortly, but I can begin by making a couple of introductory points. One is that psychology isn't suited to handling questions of value, morals, meaning and purpose. That is, psychology might tell us about mental health, but not about how or whether we should pursue it. For example, many Old Testament prophets were thought to be schizophrenic, yet they produced great ideas. A similar story is found in Sylvia Plath's dilemma between mental health and artistic genius. Moral philosophy and phenomenological description have been thought more appropriate here than psychology. Phenomenology also claims insight into issues of free will, personal identity, consciousness and other people. We have previously differentiated the general concept of mind from consciousness as all the states that we experience. And psychology and phenomenology can be regarded as accounts of mind and consciousness respectively. That is, Phenomenology claims universal structures of a transcendental ego or consciousness. Yet psychology can be said to refer to many kinds of minds and their contingent features. To further define phenomenology, we should go back to Franz Brentano before it began. Over 100 years ago, Brentano wrote a book entitled Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, and phenomenology is still thought of today as an empiricist view of mind. Brentano also reinstated the scholastic idea of intentionality, yet as a general feature of mind. Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, adopted Brentano's concept of intentionality. But Husserl rejected his scholastic notion of secondary perception for the direct perception of objects. Husserl was looking for a foundation of knowledge, but a more satisfactory one than that of Descartes. And in this search, Husserl was originally looking for the foundation of mathematics, and he hoped that this foundation would serve as a foundation for all knowledge. Husserl's primary tool in this endeavour was what he called a phenomenological reduction. But Husserl's reduction is not the physicalist reduction of the mind to an aspect of the material world. By contrast, it was another way of emphasizing the distinctiveness of consciousness, as well as that is attempting to establish a foundation for mathematics and other sciences. Husserl's reduction, or epoche, was a differentiation of consciousness from the natural and scientific world. He described this as a bracketing out of scientific and indeed psychological understanding. Husserl wrote, "I disconnect them all. I make absolutely no use of their standards," unquote. In this way, phenomenologists aren't satisfied with what they call a naive or natural attitude to the world. The natural attitude is how things normally appear, including scientific and psychological understanding. Phenomenologists aren't focused on the technical or causal aspects of things, even of psychology. So phenomenology isn't just another examination of subjectivity. It's an appreciation of an underlying ontology of knowledge or perception. But this means different things to different phenomenologists. For Husserl, that underlying ontology was originally meant to provide a foundation for all the sciences, and the reduction was supposed to provide a presuppositionless or objective view of things. This is because the natural attitude, according to Husserl, is self-concealing, but the attitude of the reduction is clarifying and revealing. And the reduction leads to a higher form of consciousness and a new sphere of being. But these and other claims of pure and absolute consciousness drew strong criticisms. The idea of pure consciousness, for instance, implies that consciousness can exist independently of objects. Heidegger, Derrida, and indeed myself have criticized such solipsistic implications. Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and others also believed that a complete reduction wasn't possible. That is, they doubted the possibility of presuppositionless observation, and that such a perspective could have anything to say about consciousness. The reduction is also difficult to implement or understand, and thought unattainable by many phenomenologists. Yet an analogy could be made to a mathematical reduction as an abstraction from the world. Accordingly, the idea of phenomenology as a foundation of all the sciences, not just mathematics, has been discredited. Yet in my view, phenomenology still holds out the possibility of a subjective account of mathematics. And for the phenomenologist, it is the best possible way of analysing consciousness. Yet Husserl attributed great significance to the reduction and said that whoever misunderstands the reduction is lost. And he also insisted that only the reduction provides genuine access to the subjective domain of inner experience. Given this insistence on such portentous significance, we might again look at the reduction. Others like Dan Zahavi and Joel Smith also believe that we should look at it again. Dermot Moran, for example, sees phenomenology as a way of revealing consciousness and as a critique of naturalism. Moran writes that naturalism excludes consciousness, the very source of all knowledge and value. Naturalism here includes both an unreflective attitude and scientific materialism. And phenomenologists seem to be justified in adopting phenomenology as an explication of consciousness, not least because consciousness is a kind of phenomenon that is constituted by its appearance. And phenomenology as a study of appearances is thereby well suited to studying consciousness. Sartre, for instance, regards consciousness as pure appearance. But even Husserl eventually had doubts about the viability of phenomenology as he first saw it. Yet many of his features remain viable, and all phenomenologists share at least two key features. One, a descriptive method that has been described as an empiricism of the mind. Two, the centrality of consciousness as its subject matter. And a third feature of phenomenology is a proclivity for a structural explication of consciousness. Phenomenology uses structures like intentionality, temporality, and finitude. Sartre names many structures like freedom, choice, presence, facticity, possibility, and negation. I would add divisibility, graduation, insularity, and insubstantiality. In addition to the character of consciousness, there are arguments about its origins and cause. Phenomenologists don't argue, but presuppose that consciousness exists. They are sympathetic to Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," but are suspicious of the "I think." Husserl said, for example, that Descartes opened the door of consciousness but failed to enter. And phenomenology dispelled the Cartesian dichotomy between mind and the world. Heidegger did this with Dasein as a being that is essentially in the world and can't be separated from it. Merleau-Ponty extended this being in the world with a phenomenology of the body, and he argues that our understanding of being in the world presupposes a kind of reduction. Phenomenology also gives a theoretical basis to existentialism situated in the world. And all phenomenologists see phenomenology as giving special access to the domain of consciousness. An extreme version of both this emphasis and the reduction is found in Sartre's ultra-phenomenological view. This focuses on the transcendental aspect of consciousness and dismisses other aspects of mind. For example, it neglects the unconscious and has an ungraduated conception of mind and mental states. a more moderate, yet no less remarkable account of consciousness is given to us by Barry Dainton. Dainton does this by making a distinction between the phenomenal self and the psychological self. That is, by using the idea of teleportation, where people are changed into data and teleported somewhere else. They are reconstructed exactly as before, down to every neuron and memory. They believe themselves to be the same person as before, that is, their psychological self. They think they are the same person because they have the same memories and psychological features as before. But Dainton considers that teleportation would be a form of suicide. This is because the phenomenal self would not have the same phenomenological identity as the previous person. This thought experiment distinguishes the phenomenal self from the psychological self, and it thereby helps to distinguish psychology from a phenomenology of consciousness. Many disciplines want to differentiate themselves from psychology, yet this need is greater for phenomenology. Yet this distinction can be illustrated most clearly in Gottlob Frege's rejection of logical psychologism. That is, logic is about principles of reason, not psychological ways of thinking. Psychologism could also lead to non-universality and impossible contradictions within logic. But the logic and mathematics have to be the same for all conscious beings in the universe. Yet science in general is subject to phenomenological as much as psychological criticisms. These can be largely traced to the idea of positivism that only hard facts count, and a neglect of subjectivity. In the 19th century, for example, science was thought to be objective and value-free, not value-laden. This is a common criticism of science made by phenomenology. That is, science attempts to remove the conscious observer to maintain objectivity. Yet I also want to discuss advantages of phenomenology and limitations of psychology in questions of free will, personal identity, morals, value, and understanding consciousness. The question of free will and determinism is too complex to discuss in detail here, but we can make a few comments, such as one side of the issue is often framed in terms of psychological determinism, and free will is usually associated with the presence of consciousness. That is, if there is free will, reflective consciousness is certainly a precondition of free will. Conscious animals, for example, without reflective consciousness do not have free will. Psychology, on the other hand, as noted above, is usually associated with the determinist view. The behaviourist B.F. Skinner, for example, argues for this view in his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity. This is often because psychology sees the mind as a closed causal system of inputs and outputs. Conversely, phenomenology sees consciousness as greater than the sum of its parts, which is also a phrase that Aristotle gave us. Yeah, there's more to say about that, but I'll leave that aside for the moment. Okay, there is also much more to say about the question of free will and determinism, such as the adequacy of these terms. And a further aspect of this question involves the issue of personal identity. Yet both free will and personal identity can be informed by a phenomenology of consciousness. Yet we should also note that another aspect of the question of free will and determinism involves personal identity. This is because free will involves the question, is it myself performing the act or some external force? And if we identify with the motivating force, then on one account we can be thought to be acting freely. On the question of personal identity, we are directly faced with the issue of different kinds and levels of knowledge. Am I a body, a brain, an inhabitant of geography, a named item, a timeline, or a set of memories? Am I a physical self, a psychological self, a social self, or an evaluating phenomenal self? Is my personal identity unified, or is it fragmented into different selves? And related to the question of free will, is my identity given to me, or do I create it? Or am I all of the above, or even something more? The multiple nature of personal identity is undeniable, yet so is my sense of unity as one individual. Although my entity is fragmented, it is brought together by my consciousness and my self-consciousness. I find myself within one space, one body, and one timeline, and that is who I am. This is my phenomenal self, over and above my psychological self. Yet my phenomenal self also produces an experience of the uncanny. That is, why am I me and not him? Why am I here and not there? And why do I exist now and not at some other time? This is the experience of consciousness as the uncanny, that escapes epistemological references. That is, I cannot compare myself to other people or apprehend other people in the same way that I apprehend myself. Moreover, Paul Ricoeur holds that personal identity goes beyond the question of what I am to who I am. And Ricoeur goes further to say that the question of who I am must be answered in terms of internalized values. The question of value and values then brings us to questions of morals, meaning and purpose. It's understood that the establishment of moral values is fraught with difficulty. Moore poses the naturalistic fallacy, Hume sets the is-ought constraint, and Mackey rejects objective values. There is also no theory of ethics that can be decisively or unequivocally accepted. And psychology is unqualified and unable to establish moral imperatives. Psychological theories of value can be very powerful, but they aren't moral mandates or compel ethical behaviour. For example, in the 70s, the sociobiologist Edward O. Wilson claimed that science may soon be in a position to investigate the very origin and meaning of human values. But Wilson had to admit to not showing the obligatory force of values beyond their social or psychological consequences. But on the contrary, we have justifiably become more certain of our values in practical and applied ethics. We endure slavery, torture, war, harm to others, and we affirm human rights, authenticity and freedom. Yet this certainty is based on intuitions like the good will is really good rather than theories. And these intuitions appear or seem to be true in the manner of phenomenological insights. My point is that phenomenology has trumped not only psychology but also ethical theory. Finally, we come to a discussion of the relative advantages of psychology and phenomenology in explaining mind. Of course, psychology tells us so much about genetics, brain structure, chemistry and the unconscious. And psychologists like Freud, Jung and Wundt also inform us about the structures of the mind. Freud offered a structural view of mind with an infantile id, an executive ego, and the conscience of a superego. Wilhelm Wundt and Edward Titchener proposed the unpopular idea of a divisible mind, and they employed introspection as a method of examination. These are phenomenological like ideas, yet phenomenology takes these ideas further into a new domain of consciousness. This is a domain taken further by thinkers like Husserl and Barry Dainton. So psychology and phenomenology compete as explanations of mind and consciousness respectively. One view is that psychology is primary, with explanations of neurology and the unconscious as the largest part of the mind. Another view is that phenomenology is primary, with consciousness having executive control over morals, choice and value. A further view is that different approaches apply to different aspects of mind, and that priority could be given to whichever aspect of mind is more important. In my view, the executive consciousness is more important because it is only here, in the domain of choice and value, can ultimate questions of human existence be asked and answered. Another comparison between psychology and phenomenology can be made in terms of their respective structures. We have noted that psychology offers structures both of the Freudian type and in neurology. Phenomenologists would claim that psychological structures are contingent, whereas phenomenological structures of consciousness are fundamental. So let's review some phenomenological structures in this light. But as we noted last week, the structures of consciousness aren't always accepted and are often rejected. Colin McGinn, for instance, claims that consciousness is too thin and insubstantial to have structures, and postmodernists reject both universal structures and structures of consciousness. They claim that structures cannot underlie the whole of human life, but they are directing their attention to the social and psychological structures of Marx and Freud. Yet phenomenologists are instead talking about structures of consciousness, not of psychology or society. And postmodernism has physicalist inclinations which rule out consciousness and thereby also rule out the possibility of structures. A basic argument for structures of consciousness is that 1. Consciousness exists, 2. Therefore it has properties, and 3. Those properties are best described as structures. And the argument can be reversed as 1. We observe structural properties, and 2. Therefore there is an underlying phenomenon producing them that we call consciousness. And this argument is reinforced by detailed phenomenological descriptions. We can begin with intentionality as a relation in which mind comports towards its external cognitive objects. Intentionality also expresses the agreement between analytic philosophy and phenomenology that consciousness is always conscious of something. Temporality is also agreed on and explicated by phenomenologists like Husserl, Heidegger and Sartre. It explains how consciousness is a process moving through space and time in an ever-changing flux. Graduation isn't universally accepted by phenomenologists. Sartre, for example, believes in a binary conception of free will and consciousness. But it shows that consciousness is subject to diminution as well as increase, with the final diminution of death. Divisibility explains perceptual contrast for both cognition and for the difference required in the production of value. It also explains the possibility of fragmentation, schizophrenia, fission, and split brain phenomena. And I myself propose a subjectivist account of the foundations of mathematics based on the fundamental divisibility of consciousness that accounts for difference and number. Insularity is a form of ontological solipsism. Every conscious being is ontologically separate from every other, and there cannot be a comparison with other beings in the same way that one experiences oneself. The phenomenological structures of consciousness offer one way of understanding human existence. Which method is chosen, psychological, analytic, or phenomenological, depends upon the arguments brought to bear and one's philosophical objectives. As a final consideration of psychology and phenomenology, we can also consider the existential heritage. Existentialism is an applied philosophy that takes much of its theory and ideas from phenomenology. Two ways in which any philosophy can be assessed are through its subject matter and its method. The subject matter of existentialism is consciousness as it is expressed in the world. The main principles of existentialism are freedom, authenticity, responsibility, and choice. The main method of existentialism is that of phenomenological description. Simone de Beauvoir, for instance, described Sartre turning pale with emotion on discovering phenomenology as philosophy. And his work is full of phenomenological descriptions of existential events, such as the inauthentic waiter, the peeping Tom who perceives himself, and the fixated judge who must condemn the man to death. Existentialism also doesn't demonstrate its principles by the standard methods of proof. For instance, the existence of the world is presupposed rather than having to be proven. Consciousness is described in accounts of our existence in the world, and other people are demonstrated in states like guilt and shame before the other. Free will is revealed to us in our anxiety. These are phenomenological intuitions rather than formal proofs. In conclusion, we can repeat that phenomenology is a descriptive and structural account of consciousness, and that it has a distinctive way of approaching aspects of life that we looked at, such as consciousness, science, free will, personal identity, and morals. This perspective was inspired, but not always fully informed, by Husserl's phenomenological reduction. In this, Husserl unsuccessfully attempted to view consciousness independently from the natural world. Yet he nevertheless succeeded in highlighting the phenomenon of consciousness. And finally, phenomenology provides an approach to consciousness as a focus of human existence. The reduction is a way of expressing the significance of consciousness. Structures enable conclusions to be drawn about the character of consciousness, as well as about the origins and possibilities of selection, choice, and value. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.